Hello everyone and welcome! In today's video, I'm continuing on with this awesome 1965 Shelby GT350 build. In this series, I'm modifying this 1/24 scale model kit into a fully functioning and seriously scale-looking RC car. As you might recall, in the last video I introduced this project, made a plan for how I'll be building this car, and talked about some of these awesome tiny electronics I'll be using to bring this car to life. If you missed that video, I recommend that you check it out. I'll be sure to include the link to it below in the description. I'm doing my best to cover every step of this build in detail, and today's video is going to focus on getting this FC01 front suspension assembly installed. So let's dive right in and get the front end ready to roll. Now, I've already talked a lot about this all-new front suspension assembly in a few prior videos, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it here. Once again though, I will provide a link in the description if you'd like to learn more about it, but in short, it's a 3D printable 1/24 scale front suspension and steering assembly that has a nice scale appearance, and I think will be the perfect front suspension to use for this project. With the frame piece this assembly has, I figured it would be easy to mount it to the chassis piece that was included with the model car kit, though of course a little hacking is going to be required. As I said before in that first video, this build is sort of a warm-up for some even more ambitious projects on the horizon, so I'm going the extra step of utilizing this chassis piece that's included with the model car kit, rather than using a 3D printed chassis as I've done on some previous projects. The result of doing this should look really cool, but it is going to require some more work. I started by brainstorming a bit, and here were some of my thoughts as I was coming up with the plan. So I've spent quite a bit of time deciding how exactly I want to integrate this front suspension assembly onto this pre-existing model car chassis. There's a number of different ways I can go about doing this, but I think the easiest is just going to be going ahead and cutting off this entire front section here, and just bolting in this assembly as it is. It looks like everything is going to line up pretty well, as you can see. The important things are making sure that it's not positioned too far back or too far forward, and also that the height is correct. Remember, we want the front wheel to be well aligned within the front wheel well. If this assembly is not placed correctly, the wheel could be too far forward, too far back, too far up, too far down. So that's something to think about. You can correct it a little bit by opening up the wheel arch just a bit or adjusting the suspension up or down. But really, you want to try to get that as spot on as you can. And of course, another important thing is to make sure it's square. Don't want it off at any angle. Fortunately, having it all as one assembly like this does make it a little easier. So at this point, and really since the beginning of this build, I was pretty set on just hacking off the front of this chassis and mounting this assembly in its place. It's probably the easiest way, and everything looks like it will fit and line up pretty well, but just for the sake of demonstrating that there are other options, I briefly discussed another idea I had that would work as well. So as you may be aware, over on Patreon, we have these cross-member pieces here. And these are designed for 3mm square styrene tubing. These are what you might use if you're building your own chassis, for example, using styrene. This is basically like your cross member with the upper and lower control arms. And so what I was thinking, I could go ahead and cut these sections off right here and just be left with sort of a bare frame. And then after those pieces are removed, essentially graft this piece in between the frame rails. Now, it's a little bit narrow, as you can see. So what I'd have to do, I've got some 3mm square rods right here. And as you can see, it's just a little bit too narrow, so I would have to modify the front frame a little bit. I kind of drew a really basic illustration here, but if you can imagine, these are the model kit frame. I'd sort of have to make some notches in it, and then this cross member piece could kind of go in between there. It is doable. What I would do is glue these pieces along the inside first, and then notch out whatever I need from the model kit chassis. And really, I think that's all it would take. Of course, I would need to come up with some way to mount the servo. With this frame piece right here, it's obviously integrated, but I would need to make something kind of similar to this to where I can mount the servo. Probably a little more work to do it that way. it would preserve this front section of the chassis. For example, if I was working on a more detailed project where it's going to have a more detailed engine bay, or there's some parts that connect to the front end of this chassis piece and I wanted to preserve more of it, that would be one option. But like I said, I think for this build, just using this frame setup here that's designed to go on a FFR SC1, it's just going to be a really easy way to integrate it. But I just thought I'd take a little bit of time to show you there's more than one different ways to go about building these, and really you're only limited by your imagination and your fabrication skills. But like I said, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting, and hopefully I can get this just to fit like a glove. So I didn't just start hacking away without a care. I actually first installed this front suspension piece included with the kit to get an idea of how high up the front axles are positioned. I took a few measurements and did the best that I could to make sure that the front axles would be aligned properly within the wheel arches. Believe it or not, this was actually a little easier said than done. I gradually cut away the chassis to make room for the frame rails. I didn't really want to remove more material than what I had to. I know it might seem like a lot of trouble, but if there's one takeaway from this video, it's take your time, double and triple check to make sure everything's lining up and looking good, because once those holes are made, you'd better like where they're at. Alright guys, so I think I did a pretty good job here. As you can see, the wheel is well aligned in the wheel well. Keep in mind that the car is going to sit a little bit lower once the weight of everything is in there, and I've adjusted the suspension just a bit. But I think that's looking pretty good. Now, as hopefully you can see right in here, I took out a little more material than what I needed to, unfortunately. Was trying to keep this nice and snug, but didn't quite work out, and that's not helping with this bit of bend. Since this is the only mounting point, there's quite a bit of bend going on there. I think what I'm going to do is just put some little pieces of styrene and kind of build this area back up and make it press up against these frame pieces on both sides. In addition to that, if it's still flexing out here, what I might do is just make some kind of like a reinforcing bracket or something that goes from here to here, some kind of brace. But other than that, it all looks pretty good. Everything seems to be lined up well. It definitely does look cool alongside the model kit chassis piece. And of course, once I get everything painted black, I think it's going to look really cool. This thing looks factory. As I said, a little reinforcement might not be a bad idea, and I'm also thinking that some kind of wheel well will need to be added so that you can't see through to the other side of the car, but that's minor stuff. I'm going to worry about that a little later. I'd say so far so good. The next items on my list are getting the rear axle installed and getting the motor mounted and driveline in place. I do expect that to be a little more of a challenge than getting that front suspension put in, but I'm ready to get it done. Of course, I'll be covering that in the next video, so be sure to stay tuned. For anyone doing a similar build, I hope this video was helpful. All STL files are on Patreon if you'd like to build one of these cars along with me. And of course, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.